Beyond Science, Conversations with Arthur M. Young. Interviewer Charles Fauvre discusses issues of science and consciousness with Arthur Young, honored inventor of the Bell helicopter, philosopher, and author of The Reflexive Universe. Today, The Theory of Process, Part 2. Continuing Young's introduction to his theory of evolutionary development.
Hello, Arthur. This is the second part of our discussion about your theory of process.
Right.
I wonder if you would give us a brief statement of what the theory attempts to state for people who are tuning in again.
Well, it's a theory of process as against structure. Most science deals with structure. Process is something that occurs in time. The primary point of it is that you begin with purpose. Purpose as first cause. And purpose has to go to a goal. That's process. Purpose, getting to a goal. And in order to get to the goal, it has to have means. And the means have to be determinate. In other words, you have to be able to depend on them. And this calls for the descent. By descent, I mean getting more determined. So the process gives up some of its initial freedom with each stage, first dipping into time and then into space, and into both together to get determinate matter like these objects we're sitting on. And from that, it grows, uses that material that's subject to laws and regains the original freedom, but now with more scope than it had at the beginning. It's important to recognize that each stage incorporates what's gone before. I say that in terms of the powers. Each stage is a new power, and each power incorporates what's gone before.
What does your theory attempt to do? Like, why have a theory?
Well, it's a more comprehensive cosmology into which science can fit better, but also into which man can fit without being subject to science. In fact, all life, all living creatures use this determinism. And there's nothing in science that permits this currently.
As I understand it, Arthur, one of the requirements of any theory is that it be testable, disprovable, actually. Is your theory testable?
Falsifiable is what they talk about.
Falsifiable.
I've never seen that applied by science to itself because it's being falsified all the time by things like ESP, but falsifiability doesn't go for anything within science.
I see.
It's only for the people out there. Well, no, this is not falsifiable, it's not testable. It's an overall theory or an overall model. It's a cosmology, and it incorporates that which is testable and that which is not testable. In other words, what is testable is a limited part of reality. It's the things you can manipulate, the things that you can use for your own benefit. The things that are beyond yourself are not manipulatable, not testable.
Well, Arthur, how would you answer the criticism that the 4 levels and 7 stages in your theory are entirely arbitrary? Why not have any number?
Good point. I mean, it's a good question. Perhaps it's the fact that space is 3-dimensional that makes it necessary to have 4 levels. If you can tell me why space is three-dimensional, I can tell you why there are four levels. Well, I think maybe I'm trying to cheat, but it's in that direction that we have to go. We have to ask very fundamental questions. Now, there's something that, of course, I describe the levels in terms of constraints.
Yeah.
And the first has to have no constraint. Well, the bottom one would have to be maximum
Yes.
constraint. So how many constraints can you have? Well, obviously time is a constraint in one dimension,
Yes.
and you would think space was a constraint in three. But actually, one of the space dimensions is always tied in with time. Suppose you look out on a scene. Now you see different things in different directions. Over there is water, and over there is a mountain. If you choose to go to the mountain or go to the water, that scope is like displayed on a screen, a two-dimensional screen. You can go there, or you could go straight up. But to get from here to there is a different kind of thing than the space thing that separates those destinations. This requires personal effort, this motion toward the goal, where the other one is a choice of a position to go to. Now that dimension, that depth dimension, is always associated with time. Even if you're measuring something with a radar, the time elapsed between the sending and reception of the signal is double the distance of the object. You cannot factor out time, whereas the other two dimensions, you can relate them to an angle and do it all by computation. No time is involved. So you really are reduced to two space dimensions and one time dimension. That makes three constraints. So with the three constraints and the one level that has no constraint, you have to have four levels. There's no necessity for another level. There are other ways of analysis that would get to the same answer, but I think that's enough for the present.
I wonder if the theory has explanatory powers for other parts of our cosmology.
Yes, it has of the cosmology I'm talking about, which is the cosmology of which man is a part. In other words, the beginning of consciousness and so on. Now, I don't see how it can help with this Big Bang business. That's what's called cosmology with science. I think that Big Bang is so highly speculative that it might. The only reason it stands unchallenged is because we haven't any data. The interesting thing about science is the more certain you are of a theory, the less facts you have, or you could reverse it, the less facts you have, the more certain you are. We used to think we knew what the history of the solar system was, but now with the space exploration, we've got so much data, and all theories have collapsed.
I see.
Too many facts.
What are the implications of your theory for science and its advantages over current theory?
Well, that you can accommodate the new physics, quantum physics, the probability, behavior of the electron, the precision of the atom. You see, that's quite the opposite to the nuclear particles. The nuclear particles are imprecise. You have to use probabilities. They call it a probability fog. But the atom is just the opposite. It's very, very, very precise. And then with the realm of the photon, you have complete uncertainty. Now, there's no basis for that in ordinary science. It's just an ad hoc discovery. All of a sudden, you come into this complete uncertainty. But with a proper cosmology, you say that that's the way it has to be. That's the way it should be.
So something that has a tendency to exist like a small particle would still fit quite well in your cosmology.
This gets quite technical. Now, whether a particle is or is not a particle is one of the big questions, you see. Now, it's all right to say of the atom that it has identity, because if you take away some electrons, the atom will make sure to get them back, so it must know what it's doing and have an identity in that sense. But a nuclear particle, an electron or a proton, there's no way for you to recognize the difference between one electron and another. If an electron goes into an atom and then an electron comes out, you don't know it's the same electron. That's why I like to look at the character of that kingdom, which has nothing, that level has nothing to do with identity. It has to do with value.
All right.
And an analogy is, if I borrow $1 from you and then next week I pay you back, you don't look at it and say, well, that's not the same dollar I lent you.
All right.
The question of identity is inappropriate there.
All right.
The dollar is a significator of value, and value doesn't have identity.
There's been a lot of interest lately with giant accelerators producing small particles that have tendencies to exist, charmed particles, this sort of thing. Do you have any interest, or your theory have any application to those?
Well, I hope when it gets settled, I can show 7 substages there too. But meanwhile, for one thing, these particles only last about a billionth of a second. Then they disappear altogether. So they have no part in the world that we are in this. They're sparks from the anvil, you might say. Permanent particles are being made, namely proton and electron. And in that process, there are these other things that shaving sparks that disappear and have no part of the process that follows. In fact, many of the, especially the so-called baryons, heavy particles, which they get in the cyclotrons and bevatrons, they don't get them when they put in more energy than would produce those particles in the first place. And many scientists believe that they are being created from this extra energy that's needed to produce them. They're not there in the first place. They're created in the energetic exchange.
I see. In terms of implications of your theory for science, are there any others that come to mind for you?
Well, I think the most important is the fact that it provides the basis for a science of life.
All right.
Now, this comes about in 2 ways. I want to make that distinction. The first is that life Bergson used to call it élan vital. Whatever an élan is, a spirit, a vital spirit. And this has offended biologists right along. They always used to find all these biology books saying things like élan vital are not scientific. You mustn't ever mention them.
Sounds like élan might jump right out of a test tube.
Well, the point about the élan is not that it's a mysterious force driving life, but that it's different from energy. See, to have a different kind of energy wouldn't do. And the exact thing that's needed is provided by the quantum of action. It's a very minute amount of energy, but it's provided with freedom of choice, this uncertainty of not knowing which way it's going to jump. The energy is small, but you're uncertain as to what it's going to do.
I see.
It's like there's a man there with a gun on it, pointing a gun at you, or maybe he's a drunk swinging it around.
I see.
And a little bit of energy might pull that trigger. So you have a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. And in a positive sense, this is just what you need to account for life.
Sure, so because that little bit of energy on the trigger can have large
Handle large amounts
results,
of energy.
right. Okay.
So if you'll buy that point, I can move on to the next one, which is another major omission which has still not been recognized in science.
What's that?
The fact that not only do you have the laws of determinism, but you have a principle by which you can control things. And this is what I call the third derivative. People get bothered because I'm using mathematical language. But control is part of the universe. And we can't say that nature doesn't use it. We use it. Every animal uses it. Plants use it. You see those little flowers turning toward the light? The scientists will say, well, there's a tropism that makes them turn toward the light. Doesn't matter. They have that control. Later on, there's more options in that control. The animal learns to have many options. You could say the plant is forced by tropism to turn toward the light. But the point is, its growth cannot be predicted by law. The growth is the option that the plant has. And it has this by virtue of the third derivative, this control. Now, that's very important. I tend to talk too much about it, but let's let it go now, unless you have some questions.
All right, that's fine. I wonder if you would like to talk a little bit about light. I particularly interested in a phrase I've heard you say called frozen light. And
frozen light?
Yes.
I thought it was frozen energy.
Frozen energy, is that right?
Yes,
All right.
Frozen energy. That's mass.
That's mass, all right.
The energy of the photon, of the light, gets frozen into mass and hence becomes certainty. So some of the uncertainty is lost when a particle is made. Much as when you have a traumatic experience, some of your energy gets locked up in that memory. Now, as you get along further, you get so much frozen energy that you have very little energy to run on. And you go to the psychoanalyst, and he takes you back to that traumatic moment. You relive it and free that energy. This also happens in the arc. The right-hand side, the built-up frozen energy gets released.
I understand. Lovely concept.
That still doesn't take care of your thing about light, but it takes care of that frozen concept.
Okay.
Now, about light, there's all kinds of things to say. In the first place, the light we see by represents only 1 octave out of 70 octaves.
Whew.
This is the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation.
All right.
And all interactions whatsoever between particles, between persons, between things, is in the form of photons.
Okay.
You'd think that two things bumping in together was simple. But what actually happens, if you could have an enormous microscope to examine, you'd find the force fields of these things were exchanging quanta of energy and quanta of action. And there's such a thing as a physical contact is only the picture we have of this, because
that's the way we
this
can
object and this
discriminate.
object are 99% space.
What are some of the implications of your process for man? We've talked about science. What about for man?
Well, as I've, I was going to say worked with people, but I haven't worked with people. I let off steam, tell them about my theory, and sometimes they get the idea. But when they get the idea, they pick up the ball and they get rolling. They go out and start doing things on their own, because somehow this idea that of the virgin birth, that it doesn't depend on somebody else. It's up to you. That's what the virgin birth means. It's not because Daddy told you to do this. It's because you do it of your own accord that it's important. And when they sort of get out from under that idea that they can't move unless someone tells them to, then they can really make things happen. Again, there's this business of being afraid to make a mistake. That's an unfortunate current superstition or whatever. Maybe it's a teaching from the church. It took the doctrine of sin and made sin wrong.
Yeah.
But sin originally meant mistake. And the only way you can find out something, learn something, is to make a mistake. So go ahead and make the mistakes, but just try to take advantage of them.
Okay. Is your theory in any way a spiritual teaching?
Yes, I don't like to advertise that.
But you feel that.
See, as soon as you start talking about spirit, you pull it down. If you see the Buddha in the street, kill him. If you can materialize this end point, then that's not the right one. There's a wonderful story about that. Maybe we have time to tell it. Have we got time?
I think so.
Well, the monk was very cold in the temple. So he chopped up one of the statues of the Buddha, wooden statues, and was burning it. And the guard came around and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm trying to distill the essence of Buddha from the wooden statue." And the guard said, "Well, don't you know that the wooden statue doesn't have any of the essence of Buddha?" "Oh," he said, "well, let's burn the rest of them." If you make a wooden statue out of spirit, you haven't got it. And if I were to advertise that this is a way to get to spirit, it wouldn't be the right thing. The spirit is something totally elusive.
Right.
And the best analogy, or the best way to reach it, is to think of the present moment. It's just as elusive as the present moment. As soon as you say that's it's not it.
Just as ever present.
It's ever present, but as soon as you try to nail it down, you've got the wrong thing.
Yes.
Suppose there's the present. You catch it. Well,
it is indeed process, the essence of your
right,
own
it's
thinking.
moving, and as Bergson said, it's creating these drops of novelty all the time. I like
novelty.
that.
Arthur, would you say that your theory of process defines some sort of ultimate or divine order?
That's another have you stopped beating your wife question. Now, David Bohm is very fond of order. Almost anyone who thinks is very fond of order. And I'm very fond of order. But I've been compelled by the theory to recognize there's something higher than order. And that is this complete spontaneity of spirit. Order means related to something else. Novelty, creativity, has to be spontaneous and novel, otherwise it doesn't have, it's like a new joke. So you must also recognize this other principle, this principle of well, it's the fire principle. It goes out, explodes. Order comes next. There's a Hindu statue of the god with all these arms going out in all directions, having intercourse with the goddess. He spares one or two of his arms for that purpose.
That's all he needs.
But she's holding some kind of object, I don't know what it is, but I was told that that was order, consistency. So all this creativity has to, well, it has intercourse with a complementary principle that feeds it through order. But the primary thing is not orderly. It's prior to order. So to have order, you have to have A and B and a relation between them. So it can't be primary. You have, the primary thing is before either A or B. So there can't be any order in the primary.
All right. So we're getting near the end of our time, Arthur, and is there anything you'd like to say in summary about your theory that we haven't covered?
I'll think of it afterwards, I suppose.
No doubt.
I want to say about the seventh kingdom, which is ineffable. But I do want to say that for that place, any goal, any distance, any direction is possible. It's total competence, total freedom. But this brings up the question of, does the universe know what it's doing? Does the universe know where it's going? And in a way I have to say no. It's learned all this competence, so it's using great skill, but it's always trying something, some new challenge, always producing a new combination. You remember I talked about the planets changing. Well,
Yes.
the planets never come back to the same position. So something is always new. And I think this is the same as the medieval question of whether God is himself evolving. The older idea was that God was perfect. And Anselm's hypothesis is that God is the most perfect being, but he keeps getting more perfect. And that perfection, that increase of self-knowledge, is gained through us, through our experience in life. We are sparks of God and doing his work in living through this.
All right. Well, that's a wonderful overview for me, Arthur, and I thank you again. It's been great being with you.